Um, Recording in progress. Thank you so much for attending the first in the SEA PGR seminar series. I'm delighted to welcome this evening to talk with us Anna Čavić from Winchester School of Art. I'm Jo Turney, by the way, and I will be chairing this session. Anna Čavić is a Ljubljana-based interdisciplinary artist, performer, poet, and doctoral researcher into performance publishing practices. She works across different fields and media, including works on paper, artist publications, performances, digital poetry, animation, and rules that order the reading of clouds from 2016, interactive audio and vibro-haptic poem objects, I'm Not Listening, 2019, and digitally assisted storytelling performances using visual aids. She graduated from the Slade School of Fine Art in London in 2008 and has been undertaking PhD research at Winchester School of Art from 2018. This is her final year. Her PhD thesis towards the theatre of publishing, performing publications, publishing the publishable, goodness me, traces an alternative history of artist publishing staged as events in which publishing takes place on the stage rather than on the page. Most recently, she has been exhibiting and performing A Thread Without End, an ongoing series of visual storytelling performances in discrete acts featuring original poetry and elaborate visual aids, a paper scroll, a tiled map, a paper cut theatre in various analogues. And digital publications. Okay, so I hope that I'm back on screen now, and I would just like to introduce you to our speaker tonight, Anna Čavić, who will be talking to us today about her project, A Thread Without End. Thank you so much, Anna. It's a joy to have you here.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you to Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities for giving me this opportunity to present my practice-led research project and to share my performance storytelling practice with you all. Thank you for coming. As Jo said, my name is Anna Čavić. I am an artist and PhD candidate at Winchester School of Art, and today I will be presenting A Thread Without End, which is an ongoing series of episodic audiovisual storytelling performances consisting of 3 discrete acts, Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 to date, in which I stage one-off ephemeral acts of publishing as theatrical events by simultaneously narrating and illustrating an original story in verse from cues provided by 3 different visual aids specifically devised for each act. And they are an analog hand-painted large format paper scroll for Act 1, a digitally augmented graphite drawing in the shape of a tiled paper map for Act 2, and a digitally augmented paper cut theatre for Act 3. A Thread Without End is the practice-led component of my thesis entitled Towards a Theatre of Publishing, Performing Publications, Publishing the Unpublishable, in which I critically reevaluate certain artist self-publishing practices, both historical and contemporary, that take place on the stage rather than the printed page, from a performance theory and practice perspective. Belonging to a tradition of oral rather than literary publishing, instead of conventional publications, these type of performance publishing practices produce performing publications, a category of hybrid theatrical objects whose main purpose is to enable the staging of acts of publishing as theatrical events, that, on account of their theatrical presentation, can be used to evidence a sustained historical tendency towards what I have termed a theatre of publishing. I will begin by describing each of the A Thread Without End performances and the role the visual aids turned performing publications through their staging play in my performance storytelling practice. The visual aids are essentially story maps, in which the text and image elements for each story have been rendered visually or spatialized in Walter J. Ong's terminology, which is a design feature that enhances their performability and memorability and directly relates to their functionality as performance enabling aids. As Ong has observed of other oral storytellers, The purpose of creating a physical story map is to ease my cognitive load during the storytelling performance, which in turn enables me to improvise from the spatialized visual and textual cues that have been embedded in the visual aid itself, ensuring that the same story is never performed and thus published in the same way twice. The different spatializations, the shape of the text and images in the 3 different visual aids, as you will see, lead to dramatically different results, literally shaping the way each story is performed, effectively scripting, scoring, and choreographing the performance of the story from beginning to end, to the point that the visual aids even determine the approximate duration of each performance. The visual aids thus are more than mere performance-enabling story maps. Turn performing publications through their staging, they are self-sufficient portable theatres, containing all the instructions and ingredients for staging theatrical performance storytelling events, and potentially theatres of publishing. By way of demonstrating this, I will play a short video documenting the performance of Act 2 of A Thread Without End. Any of the acts could serve interchangeably as exemplars of the entire piece because, as I shall reveal in due course, the essence of the piece is driven by the specially devised performance system behind the piece itself, which, being both generated by and generative of performance, is protean in its capacity to create further acts in what is conceived as a potentially endless series of storytelling performances, hence the title A Thread Without End. In fact, Act 4 and Act 5, featuring a storytelling costume and a series of storytelling fans as visual aids, respectively, are already in development. Nevertheless, because the performance system is identical across all the 3 acts, and because of time constraints, I will focus on Act 2 as representative of the entire piece. Along the way, I will offer some privileged practice-led insights gleaned from the performance and process of first creating and then staging the performing publications. Insights which are rarely made available, especially from a practitioner's perspective. Since the entire piece belongs to a tradition of performance publishing that is largely undocumented through primary sources, but rather indirectly through secondary sources, ironically, most often in print publications, the performing publications for A Thread Without End are offered as a privileged object of study, as contemporary examples belonging to a heterogeneous category of similar theatrical objects typically encountered in performance storytelling traditions, to which my practice also belongs. This category encompasses a broad range of curious and somewhat confounding theatrical objects that have hitherto largely escaped categorization. They are confounding because they are essentially hybrids of other theatrical objects such as scripts, scores, props, scenery, even costumes that a performer takes onto the stage that, unlike other theatrical objects, are specifically designed with a single purpose, to enable the performer to stage acts of publishing as theatrical performance. In fact, I argue in my thesis, which features historical and contemporary examples of performing publications, that the only plausible explanation for their existence in the first place is that they are the only means of publishing certain story content that is for all intents and purposes unpublishable other than as theatrical performance. Finally, in this presentation, I will offer A Thread Without End as an interpretative integrated model of both performance practice and performance analysis that focuses on the notion of theatricality, in which the theatrical event specifically is explored as a legitimate form of publishing. In Act 1, I narrate an original story in verse with the help of a visual aid, a 5-meter-long paper scroll elaborately decorated with hand-painted words and images. The paper scroll is displayed on a table facing me, and the audience is invited to gather around the table on all sides. The participatory performance begins with me partially unfurling the scroll and inviting audience members to assist me by holding either end of the scroll and by scrolling along in time with the storytelling performance, which consists of me narrating a story by simultaneously tracing a continuous line of text, the meandering text thread you can see in the image, with my right hand while pointing to the images that surround it with my left hand, thus simultaneously reading and illustrating a story. The meandering line of poetry spreading across the entire scroll is a means of exploring different narrative and performing possibilities through the spatialization of text, possibilities that are encoded in the visual aid itself. The spatial rendering of the words into a text thread enables me to take different looping paths and repetitions, introducing variability into the storytelling performance. The abundance of images also enables me to illustrate the story in different ways by variously pointing to one or another of the images. Thus, the audience's vision in combination with touch and hearing is likewise engaged through the performance, as in the manner of a story singer or a picture reciter in the cantastoria performance storytelling tradition, a gesture to the pertinent images on the ornate paper scroll, illuminating the story as I relate it. A thread without end is a creation story told through two characters, a woman and an anthropomorphic fox, who are repeatedly depicted performing different actions in each of the visual aids, a style of visual storytelling called pictorial continuous narrative. Typically encountered in picture story recitation, a performance storytelling tradition that uses visual aids, pictorial continuous narrative is often a clue that a visual artifact is in fact a visual aid of some sort and possibly a performing publication. In varying the text and image combinations that have been mapped out as a story in the visual aid, I am able to improvise, ensuring the same story is never truly performed or indeed published in the same way twice. In Act 1, my aim is to accentuate the sensorial possibilities of performance storytelling by exploring the visual, acoustic, and haptic possibilities offered by the visual aid in its manifestation as a paper scroll. As soon as the participants begin their collective scrolling, they engage in a shared haptic experience that lasts uninterrupted for the duration of the performance. The action of scrolling additionally generates a pleasant papery hum, which provides an analog soundscape that, through creating a pin drop silence, builds anticipation in the audience and encourages attentive listening. In handling the paper scroll and touching it in our respective ways, the audience and I invariably synchronize our movements through subtle haptic and acoustic cues, and together regulate the momentum and thus the duration of the performance. These last two features, which became the distinguishing features of Act 1, were entirely unanticipated and unintended, but emerged out of the process of first creating the visual aid and then devising a way of interacting with the audience through it. By engaging the audience sensorially, my aim is to expand the experiential possibilities of the storytelling performance and transform it into an immersive and memorable theatrical event. At the same time, Act 1 is an attempt at staging a type of performance publishing that is not only temporary, contingent, and improvisatory, but also potentially ever renewing, like the story that it tells and shows, which is told and shown differently each time. It is a pointed investigation into a type of performance publishing that, like Walter Benjamin's description of a real story, does not expend itself. In that sense, every storytelling performance is a new retelling and a new republishing of the story. In Act 2, I narrate an original story in verse with the help of another visual aid, a graphite drawing consisting of 12 paper tiles arranged into a large map, which is wired up and connected to a circuit board to make the visual aid conductive. The tiled paper map is displayed on a table facing me, and the seated audience is gathered on the other side of the table. A camera is set up above the visual aid, and a live feed of the performance is projected onto a large screen behind me, enabling the audience to view and follow the story as it unfolds across the visual aid. The performance begins with me connecting myself to a circuit board with a wired wristband that enables me to trigger soundscapes by simply touching the visual aid, since both the graphite drawing and my body are conductive. I then take up a feather in my right hand and begin to narrate the story by tracing it along the text. The feather is used in the same manner as a pointer, typically a stick or a wand, is used in cantastoria performance storytelling traditions. It enables me to read and keep my place in the text, but it is also a strategic choice for it is the only non-conductive material, meaning it prevents me from inadvertently triggering soundscapes, an action reserved for my left hand. As in Act 1, I use my left hand to point to the images and illustrate the story. But by additionally touching the images, specifically the graphite-heavy areas rendered visually as a lake, I can trigger soundscapes. The text is visually rendered as a ribbon text, whose twisting and turning across the entire visual aid gives the distinctive shape of the graphite lake on its inner side, while the outer side is surrounded by images are used to illustrate the story. Rendered as a twisting and turning ribbon text, it meanders across every paper tile on the map, finally looping around to connect to the end of the text to the beginning, signaling the end of the performance. In tracing the text, my body is forced to twist and turn along its path. And the variations in speed and intonation of my vocal delivery is also determined by the undulations of the ribbon text. Variously rendered upside down, in reverse, sideways, and right side up, the visual rendering of the text as a ribbon invariably slows down or speeds up my reading of it. The shape of the ribbon text thus provides the script, score, and choreography for the performance. Along with the cues provided by the ribbon text, the visual aid is embedded with visual prompts I need to illustrate the story. While the graphite lake is there for entirely practical reasons of enabling me to trigger sound, it is the most visually striking feature of the visual aid, and I use it to set the scene in an amorphous primordial sea, which is the setting of the story. The illustrative images on the outer side of the ribbon text set the scene further. The same two characters introduced in Act 1 are prominently and repeatedly featured in the manner of pictorial continuous narrative. When I am performing, the images are ever present in my peripheral vision, almost intruding on the ribbon text. This is a strategic device. It enables me to keep the images in sight as well as in mind, so that I can use them to intone the delivery of my speech and to illustrate the story, which I do both visually and sonically in Act 2, figuratively and literally assuming the role of a conductor. In Act 2, I consciously adopted the conductor analogy, similarly using my left hand as a conductor does to introduce interpretative flourishes into the performance to illuminate the text, while my right hand similarly maintains the pace by adhering to the scored and choreographed script set by the ribbon text. In Act 2, through manipulating the different elements, text, image, sound, and performance, and playing with the parameters set up through the strategic use of readily available digital technologies, I improvise a storytelling performance in which the story is told and shown slightly differently at each time. At the same time, Act 2 is an attempt at staging a contemporary, technologically enhanced version of earlier traditions of what Barbara Rush terms audiovisual media storytelling, referring to medieval Japanese etoki. Dating to the Muromachi period, an etoki storyteller similarly used a visual aid, an emaki, a hand picture or painted scroll, to improvise a storytelling performance. Rush describes etoki storytelling performances as audiovisual media because some practitioners added to their cantillations various sounds, rhythms, or musical settings, body movements, or even choreography, while others used such props as picture scrolls and books. In this tradition of performance storytelling, the earliest examples of which predate the advent of mass print publishing, performance was a popular means of publishing a story. For this reason, Rush also calls etoki vocal literature. Because the stories in such storytelling performances were themselves the products of improvisation, they could only be published as another improvisatory performance. Act 2, therefore, is an investigation into the notion that improvisatory performance leads to improvisatory publishing. In Act 3, I narrate an original story in verse with the help of a visual aid, this time a paper cut theatre. The storytelling performance involves me continuously arranging and rearranging white paper cuts on a black ground into a series of 9 scenes while reciting a set of 9 poems corresponding to the scenes. The visual aid is displayed on the table facing me, and the seated audience is gathered on the other side of the table. A camera is set up above the visual aid and a live feed of it is projected onto a large screen on an adjacent wall. In this particular setup, the audience's attention is divided between viewing the performance in the space and on the screen. A setup that was already present in Act 2, but is emphasized in Act 3 because the performer and the screen are separated out in the space. While all 3 acts are designed to display the mechanics of the performance in full view of the audience, Act 3 foregrounds this feature, giving audiences access to backstage production processes normally concealed from view, an anti-theatrical device that paradoxically alerts the audience to the theatrical nature of the performance all the more. The expositional setup for Act 3 was inspired by performance storytelling traditions such as Indonesian wayang berba, in which the dilang, the storyteller, along with the visual aid, typically a screen of rolled out cloth or paper densely decorated with images, and a gamelan ensemble of musicians are all in full view of the audience during the storytelling event. Wayang berba is a variation of Indonesian shadow puppet theatre called wayang kulit, in which the puppeteers visibly manipulate the puppets, and all the workings of the storytelling performance are likewise displayed before the audience. Wayang is the Javanese word for shadow or imagination, and in the spirit of wayang storytelling traditions, Act 3 similarly appeals to the audience to use their imagination and suspend their disbelief for the duration of the performance, in which the paper cuts are similarly manipulated in the manner of puppets. The performance begins with me placing the first paper cut onto a rectangular black ground, which serves as the stage on which the paper cut theatre will unfold. In contrast to Act 1 and Act 2, the paper cut theatre is a purely visual aid with no text component embedded in it. The text is placed to the side of the visual aid in the image. It is seen on the edge of the table to my left and is consulted by me as needed. I have largely memorized the text, but I occasionally consult it to ensure that I don't go too far off script during the improvisatory performance. While I manipulate the paper cuts, motion tracking technology programmed to detect movement and changes in image intensity, the light to dark ratio, through the use of an additional web camera positioned above the visual aid, is used to trigger sound, producing a one-off soundscape for every performance. The sequence of scenes is prearranged, and the precise positioning of the paper cuts in each scene corresponds to a digitally mapped grid that subdivides the stage into 10 sections, each corresponding to a soundscape. The grid is not visible to the audience, but I can see it on a laptop screen set to one side, on which a digital version of the grid is superimposed onto the live feed of the visual aid transmitted by the web camera. The motion tracking program monitors changes in movement and image intensity. As I move the paper cuts into position, I consult the digital grid to ensure that they are in the right section. One of the sections can be seen in green here in the image. Thus, as I place the paper cuts into position, I monitor the dark to light ratio displayed on the laptop screen, which has been manually configured for each of the sections in the grid to trigger a soundscape at the precise point when the critical number of white paper cuts tips the light to dark ratio against the black ground, triggering the corresponding soundscape. The tipping point corresponds to specific points in the story, enabling me to achieve a precise alignment of verbal, visual, and sonic elements in the delivery of the storytelling performance. The tipping point is also the reason that the performance starts in silence, builds into a cacophony of sounds, and ends in silence when I clear the white paper cuts from the black ground in a swiping motion. To achieve this level of precision, the digitally mapped grid in a motion tracking program is manually configured before each performance, with some room left for improvisation and for the incorporation of the uncontrollable elements that inevitably occur as a result of this particular motion light sensitive setup. While my precise choreographed movements and positioning of the paper cuts together generate the score for each performance, through manipulating the different elements and playing with the technological setup, I am able to improvise a storytelling performance that is an immersive audiovisual experience staged as a theatrical event. Contrary to conventional notions of publishing, in which, as Alessandro Ludovico has pointed out, texts, and I would add images, are fixed in the space and time of the printed page, Act 3 is an attempt at staging a type of publishing that is strictly spatiotemporally situated within the unfixed time and space of the theatrical event. Since in Act 3, the publishing takes place in the variable event time of the storytelling performance, due to its combinatory and improvisatory nature, its publishing is even more unfixed than in Act 1 and Act 2. Act 3 takes place in what Richard Schechner defines as event time, meaning the performance takes as long as it takes and has an unfixed duration. Event time, unsurprisingly, is typical within oral traditions of performance storytelling, in which storytellers tend to improvise stories using similar combinatory strategies of mostly oral composition. Hence, events time is a feature of oral rather than literary publishing. Act 3, more than any other act, is a pointed investigation into the notion that the texts of performing publications must remain unfixed texts, at least not fixed in the sense of print publishing. While all the visual aids in a thread without end are comprised of a fixed set of texts and images, their potential to be performed and thus published in ever-renewing ways remains unfixed indefinitely. For this reason, Act 3 is most pointedly a product and production of the stage rather than the printed page, and thus belongs to oral rather than literary traditions of publishing. I will now play Act 2. I hope the sound is okay. Apologies, seems the sound. fashioned him out of power. And spoke of him to the people. As a wondering to Alexander and all alone made to wonder. Full heart without our weight, we sealed our fate. To set the stars on fire without desire. Until wounded in one eye, he fell into my arms. Lay down, retract your claws. Tread lightly. I doubt his fragile body discarded its beast. Though I tied it with a rope out of my hand. And there, to this day, it still stands. The North Star, a slow burning firework, and a far away talisman. The three acts comprising a thread without end, although very different in appearance, deployment, and design, overlap in many ways. For instance, all three are endeavors to expand the experiential possibilities of storytelling. All are enactments of ephemeral forms of publishing, and in instrumentalizing the performing publications as pointed investigations into the theatrical event and the related notion of theatricality. All are efforts to establish whether certain theatrical objects can be said to possess the quality of theatricality in and of themselves. Or as Josette Ferral put it, thus theatricality pre-exists its manifestation in the theatrical object, with the object becoming the condition of its emergence. The category of performing publications suggests that this is a strong possibility. But what is theatricality, and how does it relate to the staging of performing publications? Do they become theatrical through being staged, or can they possess the quality of theatricality? If so, do they somehow embody staging or even the stage? Is the stage a defining element of the theatrical event and of theatricality? These are some of the research questions that underpin my practice-led investigations in a thread without end. During my storytelling performances, I imagine myself as stepping onto the stage, that is the visual aid. For as Judith Butler has observed, in the absence of an actual stage, all sorts of platforms, supports, surfaces can assume the status of a stage through what Farrell terms the performer's affirmed theatrical intention. In treating the visual aids as stages, they are transformed into theatrical objects I have termed performing publications. I do my best to faithfully adhere to the story map I have laid out for myself and facilitate the performance storytelling event to the best of my ability, relying equally on my skills as a performer and on the performing publications to guide the audience through the story. When Butler further proposes, indeed, why not understand the proscenium as itself a roving, movable element? She means it both figuratively and literally, and this is precisely what performing publications do and are. Although theatre scholars disagree in their definitions of theatricality, they do agree that the mere suggestion of a stage has the effect of theatricalizing everything in sight with a heightened theatrical reality. The stage might thus be the ultimate theatrical object. In assuming the status of the stage, might performing publications possess at least this property of theatricality? As Jerzy Lemon notes, theatrical performance is by no means limited to dialogue only and consists of multifarious material components, or the signaling matter, composed of live, inanimate substances, movements and gestures, words, light and sound, creating all sorts of relationships with each other in innumerable proportions and combinations. Thus, we begin to realize that everything on the stage means more than just itself. It also begins to mean something that is not visible or audible, something we can only imagine. According to Oliver Ford Davies, in theatrical performance, the actor is out primarily to awaken the audience's imagination, to link their imagination to his. With my storytelling performances, I am similarly appealing to the audience to use their imagination. But in order to do that, it is not enough to simply invite the audience into the imaginative time and space of the story. As a storyteller, my aim is to arouse their interest and then sustain it by providing a complete scenic environment they can imaginatively enter into for the duration of the performance storytelling event. As Ford Davies has pointed out, the most important thing is to share the story with the audience. And like many performance storytellers before me, I do so visually. The visual aids turn performing publications through their theatrical staging are surprisingly effective means of sharing imaginative spaces with audiences. And yet, paradoxically, most of the confusion regarding the status of objects I have termed performing publications arises out of their visual appearance, which, although very telling, can also be misleading. For at least first glance, it obscures the fact that they are encoding a generative performance system, which is specifically geared towards theatrical presentation that has been rendered visually. Performing publications thus conflate a performance system with an aesthetic system. According to Victor Bergen, it is not that objects are designed, rather aesthetic systems are designed. Aesthetic systems, according to Bergen, are capable of generating objects and have two consequences. The specific nature of any object formed is largely contingent upon the details of the situation for which it is designed. Through attention to time, objects are intentionally located partly in the real exterior space and partly in psychological interior space, the imaginative space. Observers unfamiliar with performing publications might attempt to decipher them as purely visual objects according to aesthetic principles and procedures applicable to visual art. But my practical and theoretical research indicates that this is only part of their story and that their visual appearance is in fact simply another solution to problems that have to do with the realization of their realization as theatrical events. Their visual appearance is secondary to their primary purpose as performance-enabling theatrical objects used to stage performance storytelling events. What they are is secondary to what they do. And they do that through engaging performance and audiences alike in a process of looking. What my performing publications encode is a performance system, and that they do so visually is critical, for decoding their cues necessarily involves very specific ways and approaches to looking. any description of the process I undergo when creating a performing publication that has to begin with looking at the blank paper objects before me, that is not yet a performing publication, but will be. I am aware that I am creating a theatre object that is simultaneously a product of a performance and the support surface and stage on which future performances will be produced. John Berger, who dedicated so much of his writing and art practice to different approaches to looking, offers an elegant description of drawing that encapsulates my approach to creating the performing publications. He writes, "One has to imagine the world as a sheet of paper and the creator's hand drawing, trying out objects which don't yet exist. Traces are not only what's left when something has gone, they can also be marks for a project of something to come." Although performing publications are real functional theatre objects, they are capable of producing fictional objects of the imagination through multiple and mutual acts of looking when they are staged. During the performance, the audience and I are engaged in the same activity of looking for that something and trying to find it, although at the beginning of the performance, it does not yet exist. Farrell speculates that theatricality appears to be more than a property. In fact, we might call it a process that recognizes subjects in process. It is a process of looking and being looked at. By introducing the idea that theatricality has to do with the process of mutual looking, Farrell foregrounds the cognitive and perceptual aspects of theatricality, the fact that, in her words, theatricality appears to be an almost fantastical cognitive operation set in motion either by the observer or the observed. Everything that is on display, crucially on the stage, during this process is thus theatricalized. The process is facilitated by the performing publications, whose purpose is to engage the performer in a process of discovery of their potential, which is to endlessly generate storytelling performances, and they do so by providing traces of that something to come that doesn't yet exist. Theatricality can thus be construed as a process in which the participants understand that an illusory activity is taking place while simultaneously and mutually suspending their disbelief in order to experience its effects and affects. For Farrell, it is essential that the audience is never completely duped. My practice-led research supports this claim. I have found that the more the audience is made aware of the backstage workings of a theatrical performance, the more they are willing to engage with and even enjoy the illusory nature of the activity. In my view, it is precisely this paradoxical situation that sets theatricality sharply apart from performativity and theatre from performance art. In this very important respect, my practice and the practices of others who use performing publications is theatrical. But this process begins long before they are staged before an audience. It is set into motion at the time of their creation, which is the first performance, the first act of looking, the first trace. Thus, when I'm staging them, I'm involved in a process of retracing rather than repeating, for there are different story paths to take, or the same paths to be taken differently. This process of tracing and retracing is entangled with the process of looking and re-looking, for that something has yet to come. The theatrical event is, in a sense, a continuation of the original performance and process of tracing and looking, during which I engage in a sort of play on the stage that is the paper object, which involves trying out different text and image combinations and different ways of interacting with the object. Richard Schechner's description of play closely approximates my own performance system when creating the performing publications. According to Schechner, playing in the preparatory phases of constructing a performance, the training, workshop, rehearsal phases, is unfinishable. Treating each paper object as a compositional unit, as just so much space to tell and show a story, however, is a means of putting an end to play. For as Schechner observes, play left to itself would go on forever. At the same time, the never-ending nature of play is preserved in the finalized performing publications as a trace, and this is what gives a thread without end its defining characteristic, as a potentially endless piece. And to end with, The never-ending nature of performing publications creates a paradoxical situation for publishing. For all intents and purposes, they don't perform as publications until they are staged. When they are staged, their publishing is spatio-temporally entangled with the theatrical event, beyond which their publishing survives only in the memory of the audience as a trace. Performing publications in a thread without end facilitate what Schechner terms transportations, meaning that the audience are transported elsewhere for the duration of the performance before being returned to reality. Transportation performances are associated with theatre as opposed to with ritual, in which transformations occur, meaning the audience experience some sort of transformation as a result of the performance that leaves a permanent trace. Transportations, in contrast, leave no permanent trace. Schechner uses a printing press analogy, ironically, to distinguish transportations from transformations, writing, when the performance is over, the transported have been returned to their place of entry and the transformed have been changed. The system is analogous to a printing press, where information is imprinted upon a piece of paper as it is fed through. The performance and the training leading up to it are points of contact between the press, transported, and the paper, transformed. To borrow Schechner's printing press analogy, a thread without end is perpetually in press mode of publishing. It does not produce imprints on paper. In fact, it defers it indefinitely. As a result, it does not transform the audience, but merely transports them into a temporary realm of publishing of a story that is unpublishable other than as a theatrical performance. In that sense, performing publications are a means of publishing the unpublishable, which might explain why so many performance storytellers have historically looked to the stage rather than the printed page to publish their stories, leaving only tantalizing traces of an enduring but elusive phenomenon I have termed a theatre of publishing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was just amazing. What a wonderful journey through your work and also your journey in your PhD as well. Fantastic, thank you. Can I open up the floor for discussion? Does anybody have any questions for Anna? Okay, well, I'm going to start, Anna. Hopefully this will excite people to such an extent they think we must ask better questions than she can ask. So let's start with, I think, a very obvious question, really. Your work, or the presentation you've given us today, is called A Thread Without End. You've developed a series of ongoing work which seems to absolutely have no end. So can we ask the question, is there an end in sight for you, or is this going to be your life's work? Tell us, please, what's going to happen next.
Well, so Act 4 and 5 are simultaneously already in development. So I have ideas for a costume and a series of fans, and they're not random ideas. Costume has appeared on the theatre stage before, and sometimes it has almost been a performing publication. I go into one example in my thesis where Pavlo Filonov's students made something called speaking costumes, which was so elaborately decorated they distracted the audience from the play and were removed after one performance. But it's interesting to think about a costume as a stage and a place where a story can be told. So if used differently, maybe it is a way, again, of animating a story. And the fans as well. There's a whole history of advertising fans and other fans where there's pictorial representation. And another scholar called, I think, Andrew Sofa, in a book called The Stage Life of Props, has a chapter dedicated to actually how fans were used to signal, by performers, to signal certain unspeakable things or things that were not part of the text. So the way a performer would unfurl a fan would mean something, or hold it, against their face, or point it downwards. So these are really interesting areas to explore. So that is what I'm doing next.
Fantastic, Anna. It does seem like an ongoing project, genuinely, and morphing in many, many different ways. We have a really interesting question here from Nicola Christie, who says, fascinating, obviously, yes, brilliant. Does Anna regard herself as a performer?
Yes, although that term is really, it's again, like theatricality, there's so many things that a performer means. I definitely don't consider myself an actor. I can say that. I can say what I'm not. So the whole point of performing in this way is it's a different tradition. It's a storytelling tradition. And the storyteller is, while they might animate, even perhaps more than I do, certain aspects of the story, my performances are very subtle. I apologize for maybe the sound quality of the video, but the idea is to keep everything quite quiet and not be over dramatic. What I want to do is draw the audience into listening and not raise my voice. So of course, this communicates differently when it's a video of a performance than when you're in an actual space and hearing the articulated voice and the other elements, the sound elements. So to answer the question, yes, I am a performer. And that's the most fun part of this whole thing. I do all this in order to perform. So yes, I am a performer.
Thank you, Anna. There is a second part. There is a smaller piece to that question, which is, do you regard yourself as a performer? But also, is that distinct from a storyteller?
Again, maybe I'm discovering what those things mean. I think it is. For example, I can put it in these ways. So in my thesis, I distinguish between a performer and an author performer. So while a performer, as a storyteller, let's say this performer is a storyteller. So while a performer who is storytelling is an author of a text, because their telling is a unique telling, even if a text is by somebody else, the author performer is someone who actually writes and creates the entire shebang. So the performance system, the visual aid, whatever is involved in the performance. So they are actually both the author and the performer. And those are especially interesting historically, not at all referring to myself, but even to contemporary performers I know. I hope she doesn't mind, such as Nea Tomšić, who might be here now. What's super interesting is that they create the entire environment themselves, and they're able to, alter their own texts and really inhabit the role of a storyteller, because they own every aspect of what they're doing. And historically, that's occurred often. But like the Itoki tradition, we don't know who wrote or drew the scrolls in medieval Japan. These things just disappear. So yeah, it's an interesting area of study for me anyway.
Thank you very much, Anna. I hope that answers your question. We have another question for you from Louise Siddons, who says, and I just have to scroll up again because people are just going wild here asking you questions. Okay, sorry, just bear with me. Louise has said, she says here, for me, publishing implies a public that then has the opportunity to appropriate a text for a new performance. Have other people told the story of A Thread Without End, or might they?
So that's a wonderful question. So yes, At the moment, only reviewers, which is really interesting because obviously they review what's happened, so they retell the story from their own perspective. One reviewer here in Slovenia called Radrani Perničić compared Act 3, which is the one that she saw, the one with the paper cuts, as her interpretation was that it was sort of like being on an aeroplane ride with a very sort of attentive stewardess, so who guides everyone through the story and sort of brings them back, which I really liked because it's sort of like the transportation that I realized I was doing. It wasn't something I set out to do, but so she picked up on this cue, and then she was retelling it to, I guess, an audience of readers of what she experienced and what she thought it was like. She even drew an image, of approximating the paper cuts, and it was astoundingly accurate. It featured the fox and the ladder and all these little details, which again, I found really interesting because it's about memory and what an audience takes from it and how they memorize is really something what I'm definitely interested in. So no one that's a performer has performed my work. I don't know if they could. That's another interesting question for all performance storytellers. But I would be intrigued to see that happen. Definitely.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Louise, for your question. We have another question here, Anna. This is from Mina, and she says, thank you, Anna. I'm wondering if you could speak a little about the content, the stories and poems themselves. What are the stories about? Why are there are so many elements to your work? And I'm also wondering how much attention do these different elements, the quality of drawing, words, the content of stories, perhaps movement and light in your work get?
Okay, so to split that question into bits, first of all, the story, right? The story is essentially a creation story, as I mentioned, but it's deliberately simple, not in its content, but in its design, I would say. So not the poetry itself, but the kind of the place where it takes place. So so in that sense, what I'm trying to do is actually discover the art of storytelling for myself. And because I want them to be transportive, it seemed really appropriate to set them in this kind of space that it doesn't really matter where they're going, where it's happening. What's important is the interaction between the characters, but it's really their internal monologues and their dialogues with each other that kind of set up the tension. So, you know, in a way, it's most close to lyric poetry, or maybe something like dramatic monologue. So, you know, I'm trying to kind of with words set a scene, and then the images and everything else complement that world building. So this, you know, in Act 1, I established the scene very obviously. I introduced the two characters immediately, and they just keep repeating. It all happens because this female character gets bitten by a fox, and it's almost like it's a creation story. It's almost like Eve biting the apple, but in the reverse. And suddenly the way things are change. So her perceptions. And then in Act 2, time, the element of time is introduced, which is again a storytelling element. So we have space in Act 1, time in Act 2. In Act 3, there's movement. So hence all the motion. But yeah, so I hope that answers that question. And the only thing I can say about how much the audience sort of picks up on things is something I didn't pick up on, which is movement and gesture. It's not something I intended to be a significant part of my performance. I was just doing the motions, but because the things are so precise, it somehow came across as deliberate, and some people describe it as elegant, as understated, or something like that, something in between being dramatic, but not quite. So that I found interesting. And so that's something that I kind of worked on in Act 3 to really sort of make those movements precise, like to the point that, although the audience can't see the 10 sections, things are just put into place very, very precisely. And of course, that makes your whole body move differently. And I noticed too that the audience pays more attention to the left hand, which I didn't anticipate, but it makes a lot of sense because it's the illustrator. It's the one that's aimed at the audience, whereas the right hand is like my way of keeping my place in the story, hence the conductor. I hope that answers.
Wow. Thank you, Anna. That's just so fascinating. We have many more questions, which is great. I have a question here from Karen Tan, who says, I've noticed something in your drawings and I'm wondering if I'm reading too much. There's something Gothic, fierce creatures, teeth, disembodiment in them. So many questions or curiosity. Where do you get your inspiration or sources from?
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. So I guess I have a Gothic imagination. It's book illustration, strangely enough, and also the many performing publications I have been looking at. They have astounding things in them. For example, Pradekani, which is a Persian, ancient Persian version of what I'm doing, where a storyteller has a humongous scroll, again, populated with images where the same character appears many times, sometimes giant, sometimes small. And so what's interesting is that when you first view it, you just don't know what you're looking at because it doesn't make sense. But when the storyteller comes onto the stage with their pointer and starts to tell you the story, you see the kind of map, you see the sense in it. And so what I want to say is that these representations are in no way realistic. And interestingly, Walter J. Ong, again, who looked at the kind of the pictorial element in oral traditions of storytelling, was really confused by them as well. Like, he found them fascinating. And what he said is that images in oral cultures are perceived orally. So visual images are almost processed orally, so that they don't need to be representative of or realistically representing anything at all. When audiences, say in the 16th century, looked at a book illustration or a performance such as the ones that I'm doing, when they saw the images, they didn't question them in that way. They just assumed that the oral way of understanding, the fact that something is big because it's important, not because it's actually big, is just a normal part of understanding images. And that's something that's been lost through hundreds of years, largely due to the printing press, which just made everything much more about facts. So that images need to be trustworthy now. They can't be, suggestively, I don't know what the word is, but they just can't be that elaborate, or to the point that they, approach something like surrealism, which is what they did in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. So yeah, we're much less forgiving of images now. So my aim is to become even more radical with the images, this idea that it's orally processed. So who cares about it being factual? So that's my inspiration.
Thank you so much, Anna. We have one final question and then a request. Okay, so the final question is from Reese Lawrence, who says, publishing for me often has associations with commodification. I'm wondering whether you consider your work to push back against this association. In particular, I'm thinking about the idea of event time in the light of the associations that the homogenization and passing up of time tend to have with labor practices in a lot of media theory.
Yeah, again, these are all wonderful questions. Yes, it is a pushback against that. I mean, it's a good question. Like, I'm not alone. I'm just one of many people who publish in this way. Many, not as many as print publishing, but let's say there is a remarkably numerous number of people who do things like what I'm doing. And I think it is a pushback. It's a way of not denying what you're publishing from all audiences, or it's about setting the parameters under which the publishing takes place. It's about intimacy. It's about publishing something to the gathered audience there, or this one here. So it's very specific, and it's not like book publishing where what is on the page is available indefinitely across space and time to anonymous audiences. It's a kind of different way of looking at what publishing can do. And I mean, Benjamin really foregrounded the fact that this oral storytelling is a way of building communities, but specific ones with every event around the storytelling event. So it's about kind of trying to reinvigorate that at a time when I don't really know what that means. I've just read about it. I know that it had existed, and I'm wondering why it doesn't exist as much now. And commodification, I think, certainly has to do with it. It's one of the reasons why illustration, for example, dropped from print publishing. Because again, in the early, sort of when mass print publishing became a thing, pamphlets, everything was illustrated, manuals, novels, absolutely everything came with an illustration. It was a kind of accepted way of receiving the content. And of course, you know, everything just became, the font became tinier, the columns became tighter, the less and less images. And just one more thing to say towards this is that I read a really interesting article from the perspective of publishers. So it was journalists with regard to online publishing. They were saying perhaps instead of writing the amount of time it takes to read an article, in future we should write how long it took to make it, to refocus this idea on the labor of publishing, of writing, creating images, putting content out. So it's a kind of twist on consumerism. And I think it would alert audiences to the fact that, you know, what they're reading is actually quite precious. It's not a 5-minute read. It's a 3-hour-long write, if that makes sense. So thank you.
Thanks, Anna. We are kind of pushing the boundaries of our time here. So I'd just like to say we've had a request from Nicola Christie, who said that she would love to offer herself as a performer of your work. And said that she's performed Berio, etc. So maybe you two can get in touch and make friends and do performances together, or work collaboratively, or share, or do whatever. And as we are at the end, I'd just really like to thank you, Anna, for being such an excellent performer and providing such interesting and thought-provoking discussion for us today. And I'd really like to thank absolutely everybody in the room who has been exceptional, and particularly for your questions. Thank you all so much. We will be returning in about a month's time with another SEA PGR seminar, and I hope to see you there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jo, for chairing.